What kind of steak do you have to stop eating? I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and a video was sent to me by Dr. Gundry, the Dr. Gundry podcast, The Worst Types of Steak You Need to Avoid Eating, by Dr. Stephen Gundry. Now, if you haven't been watching Dr. Gundry, he's all over the internet and a great podcast and great information, and yet I'm finding that a lot of the information that he gives is what we call preclinical, or what's called theoretical, but not tested in clinical trials. So, there's a positioning of science where you can have theory and you can write books on theory, and then there's the practical application. If you were inventing something, there's one thing to be inventing it, but it's another step entirely if you can do what's called reducing it to practice, meaning you've actually shown that your idea can work, and then you file the patent. So in the medical world, you can have an idea or take other people's information and make a lot of arguments based on that, but until you get a clinical trial, until you get real humans eating, whatever you're talking about, comparing one or another, you really don't know for sure if the theory is applied to practice, if it really works in practice. So let's see what Dr. Gundry has to say about the steak you shouldn't eat.
I've talked over and over again about the risk of eating too much red meat. But if you still want your steak, so be it.
Well, so that's an interesting starter. I'm not worried about people eating red meat or steak. I think he's referring to the nutritional epidemiology studies, which are the studies where you ask people what they eat. You don't really actually see what they eat. You ask them, and then you follow them up over a period of time, and rarely do you ever ask them again or follow up to see what they've been eating. And then you see the association, not causation, between those who eat red meat and those who don't. In my mind, in the clinical trial world, evidence-based medicine world's minds, that association is so weak that you really can't call causation or make a clinical recommendation based on it, in my opinion, and in the evidence-based medicine world's opinion. So, but you can see the angle where he's coming in. If you have to eat meat, you have to eat red meat, here's what you need to watch out for.
But not all steak is created equal. So when you're at the store and you're buying your steak to go home and cook, or even if you're at a restaurant, you have to know what to look for and what to avoid. And that's why I'm here. And I'm from Omaha, Nebraska, the beef state. And let me tell you, I know beef. In fact, believe it or not, our high school prom were always held at the Omaha stockyards. No kidding. So beef is my middle name, and beef is my game.
Time out. So it's fascinating how some mileage is gained in persuasion if you say, I'm really not a vegan, but the evidence makes me be a vegan. Or I'm really not a meat eater, but the evidence says I should be a meat eater. Or in this case, I know beef. I grew up with beef, but I really can't tell you to eat beef. That's not scientific. That's the personal persuasion of it, to show that you're unbiased, but you shouldn't be biased anyway from the science.
So, you want to eat steak? First of all, look for grass-fed and grass-finished beef. Now, we love the idea of corn feeding our beef, our cows. Why? Because that corn-fed beef is marbled with that succulent, delicious fat that gives us the mouthfeel that we associate with a great tasting steak. And it makes the steak incredibly tender. But here's the problem. Corn is just pure omega-6 inflammatory fats. Now, traditionally, cows that are fed on grass have in their fat an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of anywhere from 3 to 5 omega-6 parts to 1 part omega-3 fat. And that's a natural ratio. When we add corn to the mix, that ratio can go up to 25 to 50 to 1 instead of the 3 to 5 that we're looking for. So that juicy, tender, mouth-watering steak becomes an inflammatory fat nightmare.
Well, hang on. I'm a great storyteller. I'm lulled into believing this. Well, where's the science? I mean, okay, you can show that a steak that's been prepared in a different way, the animal being fed different things, is different composition. But I want evidence in a human that that difference in composition makes a difference. To my knowledge, and please let me know below, that's why I do this, to learn, to try to get science and evidence. I'm not aware of any paper that's shown this group gets grass-fed beef, this group gets corn-fed beef, and to see a difference in their outcomes. Even it could be inflammatory markers in the humans, but of course you have to get the high level of methodology here. Even if you did a N of 1 study, that would be a start, meaning you do your own trial of grass-fed beef, check some parameters, do your own trial, then cross over to the corn-fed beef and see what the markers show. But then you're fraught with, well, how long should you do it? And then how many carbs are you going to have at the same time? So in a program that we teach, which is a low-carb, you might say that it's ultra-low-carb, sometimes keto, sometimes ketogenic, you're not going to be getting many of these omega-6s that he's talking about anyway. And so this is it's almost the detraction you'd say about PhDs who argue about the number of angels that can dance on the head of a pin. It's not really relevant. So that you can talk about inflammatory changes or markers in the food, but to say that it's an inflammatory nightmare is a bit alarmist. Yeah, so I didn't expect that. I haven't watched much of Dr. Gundry, but I know he takes a lot of theory and then makes it seem more relevant than it really is. But I thought he was more circumspect about the language. And but let's see how it continues. The language meaning you wouldn't say having a steak is dangerous. I mean, danger is sitting on the edge of a cliff and falling off. You might say that it's risky or it's harmful or over a period of time it is associated with poorer health. But I don't like the term dangerous applied to eating a certain food.
Those fats actually increasingly are realizing as one of the biggest drivers of inflammation in our country particularly. They turn into compounds called aldehydes. One aldehyde that you're probably aware of is formaldehyde, the things that we preserve bodies with. I spent a lot of time around formaldehyde in medical school, and I assure you, you don't want to eat a steak that turns to formaldehyde in your body. And yet, that's exactly what it does. Now, the problem with marbling, and actually the problem with grass-fed, is there's actually no federal law that tells you what grass-fed means. Technically, all cows eat grass for some part of their life. If you then feed them grass for even one day, as an example, and then take them to the feedlot and give them corn and soybeans for the rest of their lives, legally, there's nothing to stop the company from telling this is grass-fed beef. What good producers will do is they'll feed them for grass most of their lives, but then to give you the mouthfeel you're looking for, they'll take them to the feedlot and feed them corn and soybeans or corn only for about 6 weeks. to fatten them up for slaughter and to give you that mouthfeel. The way around that is to look for grass-fed and grass-finished beef. Now you'll see it in some of the high-end markets. You can certainly find it on the internet.
Well, let me just stop there. So this process, of course, is well described, and I'm still not sure it makes any difference in terms of human health. And it does make a difference in terms of treatment of the animals and also the expense of these things. You know, if you were trying to make every dollar that you spend change the food environment, please go to your local farmer's market and you know, learn where your animals are coming from locally. Locavore eating is fantastic, but then that makes it out of reach of 90% of my patients in a clinical population who don't have the money to be able to do that. It's a little expensive. So I'm going to basically put, you know, I guess a stake in the ground to say this omega-3, omega-6 thing in the context of a food program that has no highly processed sugary and ultra-processed foods, that the omega-6, omega-3 ratio really doesn't matter. And because you're getting so little of the omega-6. And this, again, is like the angels dancing on the head of a pin until there's a study that shows in the animals, humans, that eat a certain type of meat has a different outcome in their body. I'm going to hold out and say, well, I'm not going to require that of my patients. And even then, if there is a little benefit, I'm going to say, well, you know, if you can do that, great. But I've seen so much benefit in people who eat at McDonald's, and that's not grass-fed beef, and they just don't eat the carbs. So here, what's the relative importance of lowering the carbs? Huge. What's the relative importance of worrying about omega-3, omega-6, making your own non-vegetable oil dressing at home? No, I think these are internet keto constructs to get you to purchase a new set of foods. And you know, this won't be sustained unless there are people who are able to sell foods and make money from this. So I have no problem with that, but I have a problem if you say that that's the only way to do it, or to say that there's there's a danger to it without evidence. So let's continue. Let's see if there's any evidence.
But if you're going to have your beef, that's what you're looking for, because it's going to have much better proper ratios of omega-6 to omega-3. So labeling is really deceptive, and if you have any doubt, contact the company and ask what they do. Now, I'm old enough to remember that back in the old days, even in Nebraska, beef was very expensive, and they certainly weren't an everyday thing. And cheaper cuts were what the average person could afford, like a chuck steak or a round steak. They were cheap because they had a lot of gristle. And that gristle is actually where gelatin and collagen come from. And it turns out our microbiome actually loves to ferment the gristle and does not ferment muscle as well. So inadvertently, poor people who couldn't afford a lot of meat, and long-lived people in general, were eating these old, tough cuts of meat, and they weren't eating very much of it. And they were doing one other thing that I think that's particularly illustrative of how we ought to approach beef, lamb, and pork in general. So they cooked them all day long. My mother would cook a pot roast all day long for us, and we'd have it actually multiple days, and that gristle would break down, and unbeknownst to us, we were actually having gelatin and collagen on almost a daily basis in these meats. We also actually benefited from gelatin almost every day in the form of Jell-O. Now, Jell-O is not a health food, folks, but believe it or not, almost every day of our lives, we were having gelatin in the form of Jell-O.
Well, actually, excuse me, in the program I teach, we do recommend sugar-free Jell-O to get people off of sugar as a way to get that out. But so now, the appeal to how we used to do things in the past, again, it makes a good story, but I'm looking for evidence here.
Now, don't rush out and buy Jell-O. There's lots of easier ways to get gelatin into your life. But the point is, we were also having a soup in those days called consommé. And in fancy restaurants, you even had chilled consommé as an appetizer. And consommé was simply high-end bone broth. Now, don't rush out and buy bone broth, because bone broth, the arsenic and lead in bones is actually remarkably high. So be careful when you're eating steaks. And for goodness sakes, please, please, please avoid the steaks that have all the marbling. You're much safer to have a filet that's grass-fed, grass-finished than a ribeye, even if it's grass-fed, grass-finished, because it's going to have much less of the harmful fats.
Well, maybe it's just me, but I mean, is it compelling? What are you talking about? That it's safer, or the danger? We're on the edge. No, I don't think that that's a good use of language. So I eat ribeyes. I'm not compelled by the theory that omega-6 and omega-3 ratio matters in the context of a diet that's very low in the omega-6 fats anyway. And that's an important difference. So this might be true in the context of a sugar and ultra-processed food environment, like most Americans eat. But in the context of a program that I teach, which is real food, as much as you want of fish, eggs, meat, poultry, this is going to be the major source of your nutrition. I'm not so worried about the omega-6, omega-3 ratio. Well, let's keep going.
Now, something that I've been researching for my upcoming book, and something I research in going to countries like Portugal, like Spain, like France, like Italy, is that these people, particularly the poorer parts of these countries, use a lot of sausages, fermented meats in their diet. In fact, the country with the longest lifespan is actually a tiny country between France and Spain called Andorra. Andorrans have a lifespan of 87.7 years. Pretty spectacular. And Andorrans do two things. They eat sausages every day. Now, these are fermented sausages. People are poor and they can't waste animals. So they eat everything, the saying is, from snout to tail. But to preserve these foods, they actually grind them up and make sausages. And the sausages are preserved by fermentation. The fermentation does a lot of really cool things that you'll hear about in the upcoming book. But among other things, just to tease you, fermentation makes these incredible mitochondrial uncouplers, polyamines. And polyamines promote longevity in multiple ways. The other thing that it does is it breaks down some of the really health-destroying compounds that I write about in beef, lamb, and pork called Nu-5-GC. So these folks, because they were poor, actually got tremendous health benefits by fermenting their beef products. So sausages traditionally prepared from Italy, from Spain, from France, from Portugal, are actually pretty doggone good health foods. But that doesn't mean you can go to the grocery store and say, hi, I want a pound of sausage meat or fresh sausage, and think you're going to get the same benefit.
Time out. Why not? Come on. So are you compelled that Dr. Gundry weaves this story and then because they do it there in a special way, then what we have here isn't the same? They're both super low carb, the sausages, and I have a kind of a tension with the pure carnivore, just the animal muscle type of carnivore diet, because historically, again, looking back in time, the animals, carnivores and humans would value the entrails and the liver, and you would give the eyeballs to those who were losing their eyes. And I mean, there was it wasn't just a muscle-based carnivore type of diet. But so again, this sort of has that blue zone, if you've heard people talk about it, that it has this sort of aura or halo that no, come on, we need science. And then of course there's the selection bias of the people who are in that area may have a genetic composition that what they do there may not apply to us. Or if you have a different genetic ancestry. Again, you can write books on this, oh boy, but show me a clinical trial, and then I'll start talking about it as a policy, or as a clinical recommendation.
Au contraire, these are not properly prepared, and they will do you more harm than good. All right, so if you want to have your meat, have it, but in moderation, of course. Fill your plate with vegetables and make meat the garnish.
So I guess you came into the video with that as a preconceived understanding that you wouldn't have red meat very often. I'm not convinced of that. I see people eating red meat every day just doing fine. Now, there might be some problems occasionally with just eating red meat, and I'll get into that into the next video soon, one of the next videos I do. But so many health benefits from cutting out the carbs. So I look at a carnivore or steak-based diet as a sub-diet of a low-carb diet. So it's not out here on its own. It's in terms of diet composition, it's super low in carbs, and you're probably going to get the benefits of ketosis as well. So I don't know. I'm not compelled. Dr. Gundry, if you don't want to eat meat, that's fine. The marbling, is delicious. And in terms, if there is a health decrement, if there is a problem with it, I need more data to be able to say it. Apparently, you sign off at an earlier level of evidence than I do. Well, so my background is in clinical trials and biostatistics, and I want the evidence to be, almost to that level of a drug, to be able to make a clinical recommendation for you, my patient, or generally speaking. So don't rely on lesser evidence. That's just not worth making a policy about. But you certainly can. Hope that's helpful. If you like this, please like and ring the notification bell. Subscribe, send to a friend. It's a grassroots effort, And if you don't have my top 10 tips to start keto right, please look in the description. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And check out Adapt Your Life Academy.